الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم وبه نستعين والحمد لله رب العالمين والعاقبة للمتقين والصلاة والسلام على رسوله الكريم وهو رحمته للعالمين أبي القاسم المصطفى محمد والصلاة والسلام على أهل بيته الطيبين الطاهرين المعصومين المظلومين الميامين ولعنة الله دائمة على أعدائهم أجمعين. أما بعد السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. So we're going to continue with our subject from last week, inshallah, which is on the subject of the history of dua. So today our goal will be to finish the session on dua, and then next week continue and begin the discussion on ziyarat. Although I should emphasize that the history of dua and ziyarat literature are essentially the same. They're essentially, they originated at the same time, and they had a very similar trajectory throughout history. And I do mention that in my research. And that's for that reason, in my third chapter of my dissertation, which is becoming a book at the moment, which inshallah is going to become a monograph. In chapter 3, I do mention that, look, I give an introduction to the important texts of ziyarat, but ultimately their beginnings and their history are very similar in the sense of it being a written tradition. So we won't go into too much depth in that regard, but we will discuss briefly about that as well. So returning to the subject of Dua Joshan and the Saghir, this text is often cited by scholars as being one of the most important examples or paradigmatic examples of a supplication that was written down and recorded and taught at the time of the Imams themselves. And this is, in this case, we have Imam al-Kazim in Baghdad. And the narration of it is very interesting, which is before we get to the narration itself of the supplication. This is an example of what I describe as the legacy of supplication, of one particular supplication being intertwined with the transmission of Shii scholasticism, or being basically intertwined with Shii intellectual history. And the example, of course, is seen here with Abi Ali al-Tusi narrating it in the month of Ramadan, who was teaching it to his students and had it read back to him, of course. And then you see it goes from teacher to student, teacher to student, teacher to student, so on and so forth, right? All the way from in 507 and 503, again in 503. And it's also very interesting that this particular supplication is being transmitted in different geographical locations, right? So Abi Ali Tusi would have been teaching it in his father's place in the city of Najaf, right? And Abu Wafa Abdul Jabbar bin Ali al-Razi, of course, is teaching it in Ray, in Sha'ban. And then you have Abu Fadl Muntaha bin Zayd Ka, who's teaching it in Jurjan. So these are all very important cities for the transmission of Shii intellectual history, for even, and now we obviously see it with regards to supplication. And then we have Abu Abdullah Muhammad bin Ahmad bin Shahriyar al-Khazin issuing an ijaza for it in Rajab 514. An ijaza being a license to transmit it. And of course, Shahriyar al-Khazin is another extremely important person because he is one of the narrators of the Sahifa Sajjadiyya. It's not that we have today goes to Shahriyar al-Khazin, from Shahriyar al-Khazin to Shuktusi. Shahriyar al-Khazin was the keeper or the custodian, who was also a scholar, but the custodian of the grave of Amir al-Mu'mineen, or of the shrine of Amir al-Mu'mineen in the city of Najaf. He died in 516. And of course, it is believed that he was the son-in-law of Shaykh Tusi. So he's married to Shaykh Tusi's daughter, according to some traditions. And this is a very important point here. So here we have Shaykh Tusi's son-in-law and Shaykh Tusi's son, Abi Ali al-Tusi, at the top, who is transmitting this one particular supplication. And so again, it demonstrates how important this kind of literature is. And then we'll briefly get to why this particular supplication and why so much emphasis would have been put on it. And it says here, of course, he transmitted this dua in 458, right? Shaykh Tusi taught it in 458. That's 2 years before he died in 460, by the grave of Amir al-Mu'mineen in al-Ashraf. Now we look at the sanad itself, right? So it's been reported from him, al-Kadhim, as we have reported it via numerous channels. This is Shaykh Tusi, this is Ibn Tawus narrating Mahaj al-Da'awat. And he narrates so and so forth from Zayd al-Nashali, that a group of exclusive disciples of Imam al-Kadhim basically come into, of his Shia, were present in his majlis, in his assembly, and they had black tablets, alwa fi akmamihim, right, hidden into their sleeves. So of course, these were the days of great oppression of the followers of Ahlul Bayt, and they used to have to hide their tablets in their sleeves and their amyal, their writing instruments, so that when Imam al-Kadhim would issue an edict, they would, of course, write it down. And this is an important point. Now, the supplication itself is very, very, very profound, as we see. And again, an issue of the issue of secrecy and fear comes in. That despite all the odds, despite all this oppression, despite the horrible situation that the Abbasids put the Imams and the Shia under, despite this, we see that they are still recording the traditions of the Imams. And this is extremely important. And this is something that, is indicative of, one, the importance of writing the traditions of the Ahlul Bayt, and two, of just the sheer determination and attachment that the companions had towards the Imams. And of course, the hand of Allah, most importantly, that allowed all this, this huge, all this material really to, not all this material, but a good proportion of this material to survive today, right? And we see that there are numerous other sources of this kind, right? Kitab Amal Shahr Ramadan, Sha'ban, right? These are all books that were written by the companions of the Imams, or rather compilations of ahadith of the A'immah during the lifetime of the Imams themselves. So we have Kitab Amal Shahr Ramadan, so the book for the ibadat, the dua, salat, ziyarat, even of the month of Ramadan, of the month of Sha'ban. And these are copied by very important companions of the Imam, such as Muawiyah bin Ammar, who was a companion of the 6th Imam, Yunus bin Abdul Rahman, very famous companion of the 8th Imam, and I believe the 7th Imam as well, but especially the 8th Imam, Muhammad bin Abi Umair. These are all luminous ashab of the Imams, people who were also, of course, to a certain extent, responsible for the compilation of the 400 usul, or al-usul al-arba'umiyya, which were the original texts before it became al-Kafi, and books like this. They were essentially notebooks of written ahadith from the Imams. So we see that the books of supplication and ziyarat, we'll get to that later, but ziyarat certainly and supplication were always side by side here. And these a'mal, or these religious duties and practices and spiritual practices to be performed on certain nights, were compiled during the lifetime of the Imams by the companions of the Imams themselves. And Dua Josh al-Saghir is Dua Josh al-Saghir, which is known as the small chainmail supplication, was compiled during the lifetime of the Imam himself. I had another slide here, just a second. I just need to see where it went. Ah, here. Okay. Sorry, I had to change the slide here. So an excerpt from this supplication gives us a very beautiful example of what is really going on here, right? So the Imam says that he has the shab, right? The edge of the sword of his enmity is pointed at me, and he has sharpened his knife against me. Of course, this indicates that the Imam is in a very unique situation of, I guess, essentially fearing for his life, that there are people plotting to kill him, that really people plotting to kill his followers. It's a very unique supplication in its overall tenor. And the Imam is reflecting on his weakness and inability to bear these, these calamities, and it's quite a profound sentence, right? And wa'ajazi, and my weakness. If I can pull up just the Arabic excerpt, I think it would be very, very, very useful. Let me see if I can pull up the Arabic excerpt here. Just a second. Yeah, here. Okay. Right. So he says, it's so beautiful. He says, وَأَرْحَفَ لِي شَبًّا حَدَّهُ. And he's not only pointing his knife at me, meaning these enemies or these people that are plotting to kill him, but he's sharpened the tip of his knife. So it is as if the Imam can feel the tip of his knife, of the knife of his enemy, against his throat. فَنَظَرْتُ إِلَى دَعْفِ أَنْ احْتِمَالِ الْفَوَادِحِ. And then I realized, he says, that I cannot protect myself against these calamities. I cannot protect myself, that I am too weak in and of myself, that I acknowledge my infirmity in front of you. I acknowledge that I am nothing. I acknowledge that I have no power in and of myself. وَعَجَزِي عَنَ الْإِنْتِصَارِ مِمَّنْ قَصَدَنِي بِمُحَارَبَتِهِ. Right? And I acknowledge my infirmity, my ajaz, in defending myself from those who have hostile intent, muharaba, who have gone to war with me, so to speak. Right? So it paints a picture of the loneliness of the Imam. Right? وَوَحْدَتِي فِي كَثِيرٍ مَنْ نَاوَانِي. And my loneliness, my solitude in the midst of the plethora of the enemies that surround me. And it is not a surprise to see that this supplication becomes a mantle of spiritual reflection, insight, and even a theological lesson, we would say. A historical, political, and theological lesson for the scholars that would follow. And thus we see such important scholars like Shaykh Tusi, like Ibn Shahriyar al-Khazin, like Abi Ali al-Tusi, and on, Ibn Tawus and others, narrating the supplication, teaching the supplication to one another, that it becomes a rite of passage among Shii, the doctors of Shii theology and tradition, and even jurisprudence, we would say, in the case of Shaykh Tusi. And this point is very important here. So we should not take these supplications lightly. These are extremely important supplications which are replete with all kinds of messages. And maybe one day we can just have sessions on the Al-Jashim because it is a very, very beautiful supplication. And it's very unique in its in some of its expressions. Now I want to move on to the question of Dua Khomeini. I chose Dua Khomeini because it is so ubiquitous in the Shii tradition, being recited every Thursday night, 15th of Sha'ban, of course, and it being pretty much universally known by the Shia community, more so certainly than the supplications of Sahifa Sujadia. And I wanted to discuss this because I think it is important, and its contents is, reflects itself, reflects why it is so important. So we go to its transmission history, one, to look at its transmission. Also because, these days there have been some people who are claiming that because the supplication does not have a proper source, how do we know it is from Imam Ali? These are all kind of things these are all straws that Shias are hanging to, and it's essentially built upon a mythical tradition, so to speak. Or it's just hopeful thinking, as they say, or wishful thinking, to believe that Ali, salamullahi alayhi, had narrated this supplication. Now, of course, these are discussions going on in scholarly circles, but there's this general, I won't say general, but there's a trend within certain scholarly circles of what I call extreme skepticism of this tradition. And I think many people who engage in this don't even have a proper foundational understanding of the tradition itself. Some do, and I respect their scholarly opinions, their right to have a scholarly opinion. But the vast majority of those who engage in this kind of discussion, trying to reduce this tradition to something that is either fabricated or to origins that we are just not aware of, right, is often lacking the information and the study and the background, the correct kind of briefing on the history of this tradition. So, Dua Khomeini, the first source for this supplication is the Misbah al-Mutahajjid of Shaykh Tusi. Right? So, Shaykh Tusi, of course, died in the year 460. We'll get to him in a bit. The tradition is mursal, meaning it is stated, Ruwiya anna Khomeini ibn Ziyad ra'a Amir al-Mu'mineen sajidan yad'u dua. That it is reported that Khomeini ibn Ziyad, the companion of Amir al-Mu'mineen, saw the Imam in sajda on the 15th of Sha'ban reciting this supplication. And it begins with Allahumma inni as'aluka bi rahmatika, right? Oh Allah, I ask you by means of your mercy. So now let's get into this discussion. What does this mean to us? Are we left with no resource to understanding the origins of this supplication? The answer is both yes and no. Because the tradition is mursal, it does not have a sanad, right? It just says Ruwiya anna Khomeini ibn Ziyad ra'a Amir al-Mu'mineen, right? That it is reported in the passive tense Ruwiya. Rawa is different from Ruwiya, of course, passive in the active tense of the Arabic. So the answer is both yes or no. We do not have a certain line to deduce its origins like we do with Dua Joshan al-Saghir, Dua Joshan al-Saghir. However, we do have some circumstantial evidence to indicate that it could be from a Middle Mu'mineen, or at least from a very early Shii tradition. So the answer to question 1 is both yes and no. And that answer, again, depends on our mabani, or our foundational principles, or our epistemic concerns, which is how do we determine the i'tibar of a report? How do we determine the informative value of a report? What standards do we use in order to determine something to be mu'tabar? Meaning that it is useful, it is valuable, and there is some contextual factors which give us a sense of confidence that it is from the Imam. Now, interestingly enough, there is a source, the son of Ibn Abi Shayba, who died in 245 Hijrah. He died 100 years before Kulayn. So this is very early. So we're talking here about the early 9th century. So he died 100 years before Kulayn. So this is the 3rd century Hijrah. He narrates an interesting discussion in his Musannaf, which has a sanad of very, very, very prominent people going back to Imam Ali himself. I'll narrate it here, just a second. If I can find it here, I will narrate it to you. It is very fascinating. It's not here. Again, this is not, as far as I know, until I've not seen this discussion in any of the contemporary or classical Arabic literature or English literature in this regard. But it's very, very interesting. So it's narrated by Ibn Abi Shayba from Abu Khalid al-Ahmar, who died in 189, from al-Walid ibn Walid, who died around, from his source, Amman Hadathahu, that Ali had uttered the supplication. So these were some of the very prominent narrators of hadith in the Sunni tradition, who are narrating this, that Ali salamullahi alayhi used to recite this, Allahumma ni as'aluka bi rahmatika allati wasi'at kulli shay, wa bi jabaruta allati ghalabta biha kulli shay, wa bi adamatika allati ghalabta biha kulli shay, right? That, oh Allah, I ask you by your mercy which envelopes everything. I ask you by your jabarut, your ultimate kingship and power, which overcomes everything, right? And then it's at the bottom here, the remainder of the supplication. So, for example, this, if you see here on the 1, 2, 3, the 4th line, says that line in Arabic is not found in the original supplication. So there's part of it that seems so similar to Dua Kumayn, some lines that are not similar, but the large proportion of the expressions here are found in Dua Kumayn, which leaves us with a lot of interesting questions, which is it possible that this originated from the time of Amir al-Mu'mineen? Because after all, the narrator of the dua, which is al-Walid ibn Walid, who narrates from Amman Hadathahu, would have been, meaning from his source, which is unnamed here, would have been contemporary to Kumail ibn Ziyad. This is fascinating here, because we see a very similar structure of a supplication that's purported to be from Amir al-Mu'mineen in a source, a very early source, right? He died 245, which predates even, I believe it predates al-Bukhari himself, or it is contemporary to Bukhari. Ibn Abi Shayba is one of the very early sources of Sunni hadith. So the issues of authenticity are built around certain questions. First, we have to look at the source. So again, I'm not saying that Dua Kumail is found in the Musannaf of Ibn Abi Shayba, but something similar to it. So we can certainly say that there are some early traditions with isnads and chains of transmissions that exist in the early period of supplications that seem to be, or at least a part of a supplication. It's not the whole thing, it's just a paragraph, which is very similar to that of Dua Kumail. As far as the Shii tradition goes, we have two main sources for the supplication. Of course, there are later sources as well, but there are two main riwayas for the supplication reports. One is the Misbah al-Mutahajjid al-Shaykh Tusi, the other is Iqbal al-A'mal of Ibn Tawus. Now, the Misbah al-Mutahajjid, of course, is one of the most famous works of supplication. It means, Misbah means a lantern, Misbah al-Mutahajjid means a lantern of the night worshipper. وَالسِّلَاحُ الْمُتَعَبِّد, right? So Misbah al-Mutahajjid wa Silah al-Muta'abbid, it's called the lantern of the night worshipper and the weapon of the devout, which is supplication. And Iqbal al-A'mal, of course, is of Ibn Tawus, and the translation of Iqbal al-A'mal is essentially, those supplications that turn us towards God. Iqbal, right? It opens our heart, it turns our heart to God. It's an act of preparing ourselves to be presented before God and to receive the grace of God. I mean, the titles of these books are very insightful in themselves. So these are two of the earliest and most important sources of Shia dua and ziyarah. And they were compiled by renowned scholars, obviously. Shaykh Tusi, the founder of the House of Najaf, the writer of Tahdib and al-Istibsar, two of the most popular books of Ahadith. He's known as Shaykh Ta'ifah, and on and on. And Ibn Tawus, obviously, who was a great scholar, who was his great maternal grandson, who lived 2 centuries after Shaykh Tusi. And both of these scholars had access to hundreds of texts. Now, this is a very interesting here. Again, this is a picture of the manuscript. So again, this is my own work. This is a copy of my own manuscript, not available publicly, this manuscript. And the writing in Arabic is deciphering this classical Arabic, which is of course written without any dots. So this first copy of Misbah al-Mutahajjid, again, a book of dua, we see was transmitted from teacher to student. This is essentially what is known as a qira'ah or a reading certificate for the Misbah al-Mutahajjid, which again indicates that this dua, this book of dua, in which Dua Kumail is contained, in which Ziyarat Ashura is contained, in which Ziyarat al-Ba'in is contained, in which Dua al-Iftitah is contained, right? That these supplications, again, I'm proving were a rite of passage. We see here great scholars issuing licenses for this single book of supplication in the year 502 Hijrah, right? So-and-so read to so-and-so who read to so-and-so, right? I don't need to go through the qira'ah, that we will get too technical. But the point is, my broader point is, we need to take this tradition seriously. This is not something, or cultural tradition. As I say, culture as opposed to deen. This is a core part of our tradition. These a'mal are a core part of our tradition. These afkar are a core part of our tradition. These things are found in early sources, of which the scholars of the 4th and the 5th century truly practiced them in their lives. They transmitted it to us, and they obviously found it to be so important that they were transmitted to one another in teaching sessions, right? And this is an archaeological example. This manuscript is 8822 from Astana Quds al-Radawiyya, copied in the year 502 Hijrah. So that's very old. I have a lithograph of it in my life. Not a lithograph, I mean a microfilm of it in my library. And then we see a second qira'ah at the bottom here as well. At the bottom there, right? From Hussein al-Qummi, who himself was a descendant of Sheikh Saduq, who's narrating this who was teaching this to his student Abdul Jabbar al-Naqash al-Razi, who was the copyist of the text. Again, this is not just simply to overcomplicate the issues, but to demonstrate how important this tradition is. Again, another qira'ah. Again, these are not, these are original archaeological documents that I have. So again here, qara'a ala, right? Min awwalihi ila akhirihi al-kitab. Right, you see in the bottom, in the top left corner of the page, this is a qira'ah, right? So this is the end of the text of Misbah al-Mutahajjid. It's about 400 pages of supplications of du'as. Essentially, the Mafatil Jinan of the 5th century, right? Of the 5th century Najaf. This was the first Mafatil Jinan compiled. We can call it the Mafatil Jinan of that age. From Maulana al-Imam Sadiduddin Abi Muhammad al-Hasan ibn al-Hussein ibn Ali ibn Durusti. Again, these are all very important scholars of their age who are teaching this book to their students. So again, we see these are among the most famous and celebrated scholars of 5th and 6th century. They were teaching and issuing licenses for this. And for more information, you can refer to the chapter 1 of my dissertation. So we learned that there's an extensive and interconnected network of dua and ziyarat transmission. So we are missing a sanad, let's say, right? So maybe we're missing an isnad going back to Ali, but we see a plethora of other factors indicating that the early Shia community of the 4th, 5th century, in the early part of the Ghaiba, had confidence that this material was from the Imam. They had confidence that they understood, or they certainly had sources going back to the early period of the Imams, which we do not have today. And this itminan and trust and confidence in the early tradition can be found in the 3rd, 4th, and 5th century. Now, although they have not always provided for us their earlier sources, we know on the basis of textual evidence that they had earlier sources that they would mention, but unfortunately, these sources have not reached us today. So there's an extensive poverty of knowledge on this subject, and because of that, many baseless opinions circulate without correct academic research in this regard. Now, Shaykh Tusi and Ibn Tawus, two of the main narrators of Dua Kumail. Al-Tusi never composed his own dua in the book. So, the book of Shaykh Tusi is not a book of his own supplications, right? We have to be, make that has to be very, that has to be clarified. This is a book of supplications of the Imams that he compiled. And it is very interesting that the Misbah al-Mutahajjid, right, which is this book right here. This is the Misbah al-Mutahajjid, right, the first manuscript of it. And it's been published today as well in several editions. That the Misbah al-Mutahajjid was such an important book that it was practiced for nearly 1,000 years after Shaykh Tusi, right? And scholars like Ibn Idris al-Hilli, Ibn Tawus, Alama al-Hilli, Shahid al-Awwal, Muhammad Baqir al-Majlisi, and Abbas al-Qummi made copious use of the Misbah al-Tahajjud. Now, all of these gentlemen at the bottom here, Ibn Idris and so on and so forth, these are the luminaries of Tashayyu, of the transmission of the knowledge of the Imams and the theology and the jurisprudence and so on and so forth. These are people, obviously, whose reputations are beyond, who don't need a description, but for many people they're unknown. But these are the Bukharis and the Ibn al-Jawzi and Ghazali and so on and so forth, we would say, for the likes of the Ahlul Sunnah. So all of these scholars practiced, recited, and transmitted Dua Kumail. So all this transmission of these early scholars, would that be on the basis of no knowledge of its source? Would all of these scholars be transmitting something that is fabricated? Or that they did not have confidence was from the Imam? Especially the early ones of the 4th and the 5th century, the 6th century? I don't think so. I really, really don't think that this is highly unlikely in this case. Because we have great trust in their transmissions, especially Sheikh Tusi and Ibn Tawus. And again, the tradition of the Misbah and its Mukhtasar, right? We see this, right? Because there's the Misbah al-Mutahajjid and then there's an abridged work written. Again, you know, there's so much to be said about this. I don't want to go into too much detail here, except to indicate that scholars like Agha Buzurg Tehrani, the teacher of Sayyid Sistani, and my teacher Sayyid Muhammad Hussain al-Jalali, Agha Buzurg makes it very clear that the Misbah al-Mutahajjid is from al-Usul al-Mu'tabara, which is from informative sources, that we know that the Misbah is based upon very important and early sources, which are also described as al-Usul al-Du'a'iyya by Agha Buzurg al-Tehrani in al-Thari'a. Meaning that there is a confidence and an understanding among the muhaddithin, like Agha Buzurg Tehrani, the teacher of Ayatollah Sistani in Hadith. Well, of course, Sayyid al-Khoury was a teacher as well, but Agha Buzurg was another one of the great bibliophiles and muhaddithin and scholars of the past century in the city of Najaf al-Ashraf. And you know, and he mentions this as well. What I demonstrate in my research is essentially I take some of the points of Agha Buzurg al-Tehrani and I take it further. So let's say Agha Buzurg's discussion is about 7 or 8 pages. My discussion is about 100 pages. So I'm taking some of the elements of Agha Buzurg's discussions and expanding it to give it kind of more detail in this regard. And this was particularly suggested to me by Ayatollah Sistani as a good idea. This is a beautiful picture of Agha Buzurg. Agha Buzurg, of course, was the student of Shaykh Abbas al-Qummi. And Agha Buzurg was the teacher of Ayatollah Sistani and Ayatollah Sayyid Muhammad Hussain al-Hussaini al-Jalali, as well as many others, including Sayyid Muhammad Rida al-Jalali, Agha Ishquri in Qom, right? And many others and others. He was a very, very, very great scholar, very pious scholar, rahimahullah. And these people like this that carry the madhab of tashayyu on their shoulders and ala atiqihim. And these people understood the tradition of supplication, they understood its history, they understood the history of Ziyarah, they understood its early origins, they have written about it, they are dedicated to it, they practice it, they follow it, they live a life of profound humility, of profound sobriety, and they don't make baseless comments and opinions on things that they don't understand and that they don't know. So my suggestion, my humble suggestion as a brother, to those other brothers and sisters who want to, study the deen in depth, my suggestion to them is to reserve their opinions, to reserve their comments on things that they perhaps have not gotten a full, looked at it from all the various angles before they make comments and revert to the great traditionists on these subjects. Read their books, understand them, study with their students. And mind that their students are now very old, whoever is surviving now of them, or at least with the students of their students, right? Sheikh Wahid al-Khurasani is another one of this, from this generation as well, right? And there are very few of them that are now surviving of this generation. And alhamdulillah, we've been blessed to have had access to these people, to read their books, to study with their students rather, and to continue to transmit this tradition. So there are two examples of why these books of dua are so important. Ibn Tawus says something very interesting here. So the point is, what I'm trying to demonstrate here is that Shaykh Tusi was a scholar beyond repute, no doubt. I mean, he's Shaykh al-Ta'ifah, right? The Shaykh of the whole madhab, right? And his position in the community as a scholar, as a muhaddith, as a faqih, as a historian, as a mufassir, as a commentator on the Quran is beyond repute, beyond repute, right? He moved from Baghdad to Najaf and established his teachings from Baghdad to the holy city of Najaf al-Ashraf. So the question is, when he compiles a book of supplication, again, in this book, we have Ziyarat Ashura, Ziyarat al-Ba'im, Dua al-Qummi, Dua al-Iftitah, and other famous traditions as well, and A'mal and things like this as well. When he compiles a book like this, what would have it meant to him is the question. And here Ibn Tawus gives a very beautiful description where he says, in describing the Misbah al-Mutahajjid, he says, the one who composes a book of ritual worship must himself, يعني تقلد العمل بما فيه, that as soon as somebody compiles a book of ritual devotion, he himself must follow the acts of worship that he himself has written down and compiled as being something recommended for the faithful, for the one who acts upon its meanings. So the one who compiles this must be practicing it himself. And it is understood that Shaykh Tusi had compiled this work, and Shaykh Tusi himself was practicing these supplications and these ziyarat. And for the early scholars, that is very important, because that is a sign of its i'tibar, that is a sign of its usefulness, of its importance, and its significance. And Ibn Tawus, in describing the Misbah al-Mutahajjid, he says, Ibn Tawus himself is, I should say, is described by al-Hilli as as someone who used to perform miracles, Sahib al-Karamat. He's, of course, Ibn Tawus was a great figure in himself. He died in 664 Hijrah. Ibn Tawus, in describing the Misbah al-Mutahajjid, he says, I found something great and replete with benefit in the Misbah al-Kabir of my grandfather, which he compiled for my mother. It's very interesting. He compiled it for my mother, rather it should be mothers, ummuhat, that he compiled it for my mothers. So this is the first point, that the Misbah al-Mutahajjid was compiled for the women. They were the first ones to get the first copies, so to speak, to get the early copies of it. And of course, it's allowed them to organize their spiritual calendar, right, through the year, because it's divided by month, right? It goes from Ramadan to Sha'ban, which is very interesting how he begins with Ramadan, although it's not the first month, but he says spiritually it's the first month, right? And then he ends with, so he goes from Ramadan forward, ending with Sha'ban. So Dua al-Qummi comes at the end of the Misbah al-Mutahajjid, right? Because it comes to Sha'ban. So he goes from Ramadan to Sha'ban, which is of course different from how Abbas Qummi has done Mafatir al-Jinan. And Ibn Tawus says himself that it was the Misbah al-Mutahajjid that led him down a path of spiritual discovery, after which he wrote 11 addendums to the Misbah al-Mutahajjid. 11 volumes of dua and ziyarat literature, dealing with different issues, with traveling, with, exigent circumstances, with supplications of the month, of the day, of the year, so on and so forth, on istikhara, on all different kinds of subjects. He wrote 11 volumes, and the beginning of his journey was in the spot of the Hajj of his grandfather, Shaykh Tusi. Ibn Tawus, of course, is among the most celebrated and spiritual authorities of Shii history. al-Hilli, wrote Minhaj al-Salah fi Ikhtisar al-Misbah. Right? Again, Allama Hindi did not write his own book of supplication that has survived this. He just wrote an abridgment of Misbah al-Mutahajjid. So again, showing how important this book was through the centuries. And again, in this book, as I emphasize, is Dua Qummi, Ziyarat Ashura, Ziyarat Arba'in, Dua al-Iftitah, and on. Right? Again, not all the famous supplications are found in there, and that doesn't mean that they're not authentic, but I'm talking about this particular book and Dua Qummi, Ziyarat Ashura, and on, which are found in this particular text. And what does Allama Hindi say? Of course, Allama Hindi, again, along with Ibn Tawus being one of the most famous scholars of Shii history, was believed that he had met the 12th Imam or had some miraculous interaction with the 12th Imam. Of course, Allama Hindi is buried right outside the grave of the Mu'mineen, right? To his, I believe, to his right is Allama Hindi, to the left is Muqaddis al-Jabili, or vice versa. But there, he's right out, soon as you come out of the Haram of the Mu'mineen, out of the Dari area of the Mu'mineen, right outside for the entrance is Allama Hindi's grave. And Allama Hindi says, our greatest Shaykh, Shaykhuna al-A'zam, Shaykhuna al-A'zam, and foremost, Abu Ja'far al-Tusi, composed a source of powerful devotional rites, al-Quwwa al-Amaliyya. Allahu Akbar, Allahu Akbar. Look at the language. We have to pay attention to the language that someone like Allama Hindi is using. People like Allama al-Hindi do not use flowery language for the sake of it, just to impress us. When he says Shaykhuna al-A'zam, he means Shaykhuna al-A'zam, our greatest Shaykh, has compiled a book of al-Quwwa al-Amaliyya, powerful devotional rites. Right? These are the power of devotion, which as I mentioned in the first session, it becomes a ship of salvation, saving us from the darkness that this dunya can be, or from the darkness that can, grow upon the hearts in this dunya. That this connection to Allah through the Imams, through their supplications, through their ziyarats, becomes the source, al-Quwwa al-Amaliyya, the source of power. It becomes the source of strength, the source of enlightenment. And he says most of it is trusted to be from the Imams, hence I abridged it. So that was the opinion of Allama al-Hindi, who himself narrates in Minhaj al-Salah, Dua Qummi, Ziyarat Ashura, even Dua Tawassul is in there. He narrates Ziyarat Arba'in, I believe, as well, of course. So, and he narrates many of these things. It's not a small book. Again, you won't find everything in Minhaj al-Salah, fi Ikhtisar al-Misbah, right? The path of the righteousness and abridgment of the Misbah. That's the title, or the translation of it. And then, of course, we have here an Asnad map for Misbah al-Kabir, again, demonstrating how it was diffused and transmitted. There's a lot of details here. Don't need to go through everything. This is all found, of course, in the dissertation and the monograph, inshallah. So you see, it begins with Shaykh Tusi, going to his immediate, so the first generation of his students were Sayyid al-Ajjal al-Murtada bin Ali Hassan bin Mutahhar, Shah Rashid bin Abi Nasr bin Jaysh al-Sarawi, Ibn Ali al-Tusi, and Abu Ja'far Muhammad bin Muhsin al-Halabi. So then I want to come to another point, because the subject of this session is the history of Dua and Ziyarat. But I do promise in our next session, in our third session, I will go through Dua Qummi, look at some of its themes, at its spiritual themes, why it is a mosaic of Islamic spirituality. I do devote our third session to that. Please do not worry. I will have an entire hour devoted to that. Right now we're looking at the history, and then we will get to the text itself, inshallah. But I wanted to still, answer some of the doubts and accusations that come, unfortunately, from even pulpits, or I wouldn't say pulpits, but certain speaking platforms. One of them is about the amal of the Quran in the month of Ramadan. That there is the accusation that this amal of putting the Quran on our head, right, in the night of Qadr, is fabricated. It has no basis, so on and so forth. Of course, this could not be further from the truth, unfortunately. This amal is from Imam al-Sadiq. It's narrated from Imam. Unfortunately, the Arabic did not all show up on the slide there, but basically the narration indicates that there is a sanad for it from Imam al-Sadiq. Now this matters because unfortunately there was a speaker who made some accusations saying that that this is just a ritual that has no basis. Shias just practice things that they don't know, that they don't understand, and they just put this Quran on their head and they don't know what they're doing with it, and so on and so forth. And that's not true. There is an isnad for this, going back to Imam al-Sadiq alayhi salam. It is very famous. We know about it. It is well transmitted and well known. And I don't, yes, not everybody is a specialist in these sources, in knowing what these sources are, these early sources, which is fine. But the likes of Shaykh Abbas, al-Qummi, understood these sources. Again, I'm not saying that everything that Abbas Qummi has included is sahih and authentic. No, it's not. We can't say that about anything but the Quran. However, we have some confidence that he knew what he was doing. As a great muhaddith, as a student of Nuri Tabrasi, and so on and so forth. But nevertheless, this amal of the Quran, right, where we say, وَبِحَقِّكَ عَلَيْهِمْ, right? فَلَا أَحَدُ أَعْرَفُ بِحَقِّكَ مِنْ بِكَ يَا Allah, right? بِكَ يَا Muhammad, and so on and so forth. That this act of devotion in the month of Ramadan has its origins from the Imams themselves. So there's one from Imam al-Sadiq, there's another one transmitted from Ali bin Yaqtin from Imam al-Kadhim, right? Where he says, خُذَ الْمُصْحَفْ فِي يَدِكَ وَارْفَعَهُ فَوْقَ رَأْسِكَ, right? That take the Quran in your hand, lift it up and put it on top of your head in the month of Ramadan. So, and then look, وَبِالْحَسَنِ عَشْرَ مَرَّاتِ وَبِالْحُسَيْنِ وَبِعَلِي ibn Hussein, and so on and so forth. وَبِ Muhammad ibn Ali, وَبِ Ja'far ibn Muhammad, right? And in the case of the one of Imam al-Sadiq, it ends with Imam al-Sadiq, which is very, very interesting, right? The riwayah going to Imam al-Sadiq ends with Imam al-Sadiq, and then says, be Imam, be Imam, be Imam. Meaning that then you do it from, so if we're at the time of Imam Mahdi, then we go all the way to Imam al-Mahdi. Right, and then again we have another riwayah to this effect. Unfortunately, the Arabic did not come up, but where the Imam says, فَإِنَّكَ لَا تَقُومُ مِنْ مَوْضِعِكَ حَتَّى يَقْضِي لَكَ حَاجَتِكَ وَتَيَسَّرُ لَكَ أَمْرِكَ. That you will not stand up from your place until your needs are granted and your affair shall be made easy by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. I will end there. If there are any questions, inshallah, feel free to ask questions. Like I mentioned, next week, we'll go into the details of Dua al-Kumail. We'll introduce the Ziyarat. In the last session, we'll talk about the Ziyarat of Imam Hussein alayhi salam. So, but I wanted to devote really 2 full sessions to the history of this literature. We'll finish off this discussion of the history of the literature, of course, next week. Oops, sorry.
Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you. Please go ahead.
Assalamu alaikum. So this reminded me of a discussion I had with somebody who was very skeptical of the Shia tradition.
Yes.
And they invoked the Gospels as a sort of like paradigm of, problematic transmission.
Yes.
So what I said to them, I said, Muslims don't have a problem with the Gospels as such. We have a problem with the idea that Jesus is God incarnate, right? Our issue,
Yes.
just because the Gospels doesn't have a synod, and there may be certain things in there that like Jesus didn't say, but like there's a lot in there that we consider probably true and beautiful, but it's more the content that's problematic for us, not necessarily, the fact that it doesn't have a synod or something like that. And they were like, because I think they were so wrapped up in the idea of like, you have to have a synod, it has to be sahih. They didn't like accept that argument from me. But to this day, I feel like that's the right way of looking at things. And this reminded me of that. It's like the content of Dua Kumail is so amazing and powerful, whether it's attributed to Imam Ali or not is sort of secondary to me. But I don't know if you think that's a healthy way of
Yes,
thinking about it.
yeah, it is. And this was the position of Alama Tabatabai, and others. But at the it is its very attribution to Ali which gives it its charisma, right? Because knowing that it comes from an infallible source obviously gives it that sense of of it having further or deeper kind of spiritual effect, so to speak, or it's more spiritually efficacious, of course. Yeah, exactly. So I think your point about the gospel is very interesting here, which is perhaps similar in some senses to what I'm trying to emphasize, which is that we have a communal memory. And that communal memory is not on the basis of one or two people. That's on the basis of an entire tradition of communal memory, right? That have transmitted this supplication, taught this supplication, recorded its contents. And those very same people that we consider to be trustworthy in the transmission of riwayah. You see, this is an important point. Like Shaykh Tusi, like Ibn Idris, like Alam al-Hindi, and so on and so forth, right? That we consider these individuals to be profoundly trustworthy. We consider them to be the vanguards of Tashayyu. And these vanguards of Tashayyu are practicing, narrating, and copying this supplication and others like it in Misbah al-Mutahajjid. Now that doesn't mean in itself that it is from Ali. Now, again, as I demonstrated, there are other contextual factors. The fact that Shaykh Tusi had earlier sources, the fact that it is found in the Musannaf, or parts of it are found in the Musannaf of Ibn Abi Shayba and other sources like this. But we have to take into account all these contextual factors when building a case of i'tibar, something that is known as i'tibar. And we'll continue this discussion next week in more details. I have a couple of more slides about it. But yes, you're correct. And we cannot just simply dismiss this tradition and say, oh, well, I don't have a sanad for it, so it doesn't, it's not authentic. I think this approach to hadith and this approach, especially to supplications and things like this, is actually the minority approach. It is the Shadh approach, as Sheikh Muhammad Sanad describes recently. This is not the majority approach. This is not the predominant approach to tradition. This is a hypercritical, hyper-skeptical approach, which I also think is to a certain extent informed by Western Orientalism, especially among some of the youngsters today who really have not put their time into this tradition to understand it, and its communal memory and its communal scholastic memory as well. So not just communal, but communally and communal scholastic memory in this regard. So I guess in that sense, the gospel can be, a parallel perhaps can be made with the gospel. Do you have any other questions?
No, thank you. Oh, actually, I did have a question about the Eitan Kolberg book that you had in the slide.
Yes.
Um, I mean, that's a really expensive book, but it looks really interesting. Do you think is it something worth reading, or is it, you know, for
Well,
really a?
it's just a bibliography of his
Oh,
sources.
okay,
So
I
I
see.
mean, I mean, the introduction is good. I can email you a PDF of it if you'd like to look at the introduction. The introduction is very nice because he talks about his life, the life history of Ibn Pawus.
Oh yeah, that'd be cool.
So it is very nice. But the rest is just a bibliography. So basically an index of the library of Ibn Pawus.
Oh wow.
Right?
Okay,
And
so it's
he's
kind of almost like the Fihrist or something.
yeah, it's like a Fihras of Ibn Pawus. Something Kohlberg and I discussed because Kohlberg never had a chance to follow up on the books of supplications. So Kohlberg suggested to me to get that job done, you know, to work on that. And that's what I've done for the last 7 years. To that
Oh,
effect.
cool.
Yeah.
Who's gonna publish your dissertation?
Either Brill or Gorgeous Press.
Oh, cool.
Yeah.
I just ordered that Fatima
The
book.
Daughter of Muhammad.
Yeah, they had it for sale in paperback for only like
Yeah,
33
yeah.
bucks.
Yeah, otherwise they're like $100. I mean, like,
Yeah.
so expensive. Yeah, exactly. So, okay, inshallah. So if you don't have any more questions, we'll conclude there. And I'll post the self-assessment later on, inshallah. Maybe later on tonight.
All right, thank you very much.
Okay, take care, inshallah. Assalamu alaikum.
Thank you so much for the